Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and you're watching Conscious TV, and I'm here with Martin Aylward. Martin is a Buddhist teacher with particular interest in closing the gap between meditation retreats and really bringing that practice into everyday life. So in today's interview, we're going to be talking about Martin's retreat, Work, Sex, Money, Dharma. But maybe as a starting point, Martin, how you first got into Buddhism, because I know you were only 19 years old when all of this started for you.
Yeah. So, well, mainly I think it was out of the confusion and angst of teenage life, really. Just having a sort of restless searching, which I wouldn't have called a spiritual search particularly, but I had some sense of the power and beauty of youth and the mystery of being alive and being conscious. And the options that seemed available to me to pursue that, career, studies, etc., just didn't seem like they fulfilled the kind of that restless searching. So going to India,
because 19 years old is quite young to really go on a spiritual search.
Yeah, well, I guess the last couple of years of school, 17, 18, I was feeling increasingly desperate for something very different than the milieu I'd grown up in. And so I travelled a little bit in the Middle East, and then I earned some money working as a milkman for 6 months, and went off to India. First I went to Goa and got a little sidetracked for a couple of months, but then I went up to near Dharamsala, to the foothills of the Himalayas, and I went to a meditation course initially, and I would say probably 20 minutes in to the first evening introduction of that course, I just had an extraordinary sense of homecoming and of relief, and the sense that all that restless searching, this is what I was looking for without knowing that. And from that moment I knew this is worth engaging in, this is worth committing all this time, energy and passion I have, this is what I'm going to do.
And had you had any spiritual interests before the meditation course? I mean, was there a sense that you were looking for something?
I had some, just all through my teenage years, a strong sense of just the mystery of being conscious, I guess. I lived, my family house was on a busy road, and the bus from school would drop me maybe 500 metres, and I'd walk down the edge of this busy road towards my house with cars shooting by just next to me. And it became a kind of natural contemplation each evening, like that sense of proximity to death. And without calling it any kind of spiritual contemplation, I used to every night just what would that be like if I was to just step a metre? Clearly I would die, but what would that mean? And just contrasting the sense of being alive and the fullness of what that felt like, which it wasn't just body movement and all of that, but a clear sense of this mysterious property called being conscious. And what would happen to that? And so I guess by the time I left on my travels, amidst this restless searching, was this kind of great open question of what is it, the fact of being conscious? And nobody and nowhere that I came across seemed to have, certainly not any answers for that, but actually not even any kind of engagement with the question. Right. And so when I got to India, there was, that was like the whole culture seemed to be built around the fact that there's a mysteriousness to consciousness, and there's all these technologies to explore what that mystery is and how to meet it head on and open it up and understand it, and in the process to transform our own being. And so that just met me right where I was at.
And so you had that experience on that meditation workshop. So how did the path unfold from that? Because it could just have been an experience where you went, oh, that was interesting, but it sounds like something really profound happened for you that kind of initiated a path from that point.
Well, my commitment felt immediately very strong, and actually it was a bit gung-ho. I was 19. I was kind of wild, I guess, in many ways. So after this 10-day course, I thought, that's it, I'm off to the hills, off to the cave, off to, some kind of archetypal image of myself as a kind of renunciate. And on the way up to find a cave, I met a sadhu, a wandering Hindu renunciate, who I'd met about 1,000 miles away in South India a few months previously. And we recognised each other. He said, "Oh, where are you going?" I said, "Oh, I'm off to the cave to meditate." And he thought, "Oh God!" So he said, "Look, go up here, around there, over there." And he said, "There's one sadhu, another swami, another hermit, living just there. Maybe you can stay with him." So I was a little relieved at that, because even though I felt like I ought to go off to the cave, I was,
So you're going to go by yourself just to go?
Yeah,
wow. Okay.
Anyway, so I went to see this man, and in a little difficult conversation, because he didn't really speak English, he said, "Okay, you can stay with me for 3 days, and you sleep here, and you stay 3 days." And I spent the next 2.5 years there, pretty much, on and off, coming and going. When my visa ended, I went to Thailand and spent 3 months in a monastery, and then I'd come back, and I'd go off to do various Buddhist retreats. And my practice was very much grounded in the Buddhist tradition since that first meditation course. And he was from a Hindu background. But he was very free in his approach. He wasn't identified with this technique or that tradition. He had a very, very free heart. And he said, "Look, you've got to practice. You do your practice." But there was something in the quality of just living with him and spending time with him, and just a kind of intimacy of heart and of consciousness that was profoundly transformative and beautiful for me.
And as you were, doing obviously a lot of daily practice and, away from, I guess, the kind of the noise and the kind of the busyness of day-to-day life, what was happening for you in terms of your own process? I mean, it sounds, on one hand quite idyllic, being in the mountains meditating, but I imagine also quite challenging, that there's not the distractions of day-to-day life. So what kind of happened for you in your process at that time?
Well, I was, like I said, I was quite gung-ho in many ways, so I was very intensely involved. I was doing a lot of meditation practice, and I was very isolated. I was only really in communication with Babaji, my teacher, aside from and other Buddhist teachers when I'd go away to those courses. So my inner life was changing and opening up in all kinds of extraordinary ways, And so having very, very expansive experiences, spending a lot of time in states where my usual sense of myself and my personality seemed more or less irrelevant or unfindable. And I wasn't fearful around that. I really embraced that. I was so hungry for a kind of profound transformation. But it did mean that when it came to interacting conventionally with people, I got very lost, actually. I found myself kind of totally... I didn't know how to be with Westerners, particularly. If I came across a Westerner in the nearby town, I was like, oh my... And I would just avoid at all costs and escape back to the hermitage.
Well, I remember you were saying, we were chatting earlier, that, when you'd go out to buy food in the morning, that you would leave as early as you possibly could, because you were saying even at 100 metres away, you would struggle with that kind of relationship with, with somebody when, I guess a lot of what you were doing was discovering who you were without a personality, but that can make it quite difficult then to be in a relationship with people.
Yeah, there was no integration, basically.
Right.
and looking back, that it all were unfolded perfectly, if you like, but actually at the time it was quite frightening in many ways. I mean, the expanded stuff wasn't frightening. It was the trying to work out how to do the normal stuff I used to do, how to be social in a normal way. That was very confronting. So after about the first year and a half after I was there, Babaji told me basically, okay, enough of this. Now your practice is go back to Europe, go and see your family. My parents were thought I'd really lost the plot, and I was very worried. I was thought, if I can't manage to speak to one foreigner when I meet them in the market, how am I going to manage a whole country full? So,
but I think it's also, I really like the way that that your teacher recognised that the next step in your path was to go back into the world, because I think it's very possible for somebody to go away and have a few years in a retreat environment like that, and to kind of just abdicate living in the world from that point, that their life just becomes living as a hermit. And for your teacher to see that the next piece was to go back into the world and to find a way to integrate that, I think was really great. I'm wondering how you felt kind of almost being sent away, with him saying, right, the next step is to, because from what you were saying, there was a certain amount of fear about, about
and my
relating.
trajectory was to just leave all that behind,
right,
because it seemed fraught with complexity, and to kind of abide in the vast pure realms of and simplicity of being being in kind of remote rural India.
So what was that like? I mean, the first day kind of leaving and, knowing that you've gone from the safety and security in some ways of having these very expansive experiences, but I guess the holding environment of your teacher back into the world.
Yeah.
I mean, how was that?
Underneath there was some longing to be able to function conventionally as well as all of that, and I had a great deal of trust in him. And so when he said, "Right, off you go," I sort of swallowed that and left. And I remember on the morning I left having a bit of a kind of freak out and thought, well, how am I going to manage? And he said, "Just here to the bus stand." And then he told me Om Namah Shivaya, this very classic Hindu mantra. He said, "Just steady your mind with this mantra, Om Namah Shivaya, from here to the bus stand, and everything will be okay." So I thought, easy for you to say, So I went off to the bus, Om Namah Shivaya. And to cut a long story short, on the bus to Delhi, I met these two English guys that were sitting in front of me in the bus. And when we stopped at a tea stall on the way to Delhi, and they saw me, I was wearing a lungi, I didn't have any trousers, I had this bag made of an old rice sack. And they started asking me, what are you doing? Where have you been? And I started to explain a little bit, and I was clanking around in this bag that contained various bits of Hindu hermit paraphernalia, nothing would be any use to me back in the UK. One of them said to me, "Listen, if you can get as enthusiastic about other Indian things as you can about all this old clobber, I'll give you a job in London." And he gave me his card. So I said, "Wow, Babaji told me just
get to the bus.
Just get to the bus, steady your mind, everything will be okay." And already before I had a job got to Delhi, this guy gave me a job. So working in Camden Market and St Martin in the Fields, as was then, which was the counterpoint exactly that I needed to re-engage relationally and really bring and integrate all that kind of vast expanded experience and sort of deconstruction of myself into London again.
Well, what a contrast! I mean, from the Himalayas to Camden Market.
Yeah.
I mean, what was that like for you initially? Having had that sense of expansiveness and openness and the intimacy of your relationship to your teacher, to then be there, without your teacher, in Camden Market with people, demanding and having to interact. What was that like for you initially?
Well, actually, what happened was that a very strong, tangible sense of limitless possibility, actually, because where there had been no integration before, this sense of having all these extraordinary experiences, but a complete struggle in the conventional realm, and as that started to get evened out more, I just sensed a sense of anything's possible, and I think where that came from was this real conviction in the same way that on that first evening of that first meditation course, knowing that this is my inner compass, this is what I can trust, this is what's really juicy. That really started to just stayed really strong for me. And so whatever was happening conventionally, it was the sense of keep this passion for inner life and what consciousness is, and the potential I'd started to learn for life opening up, keeping that central. And then it seemed like really whatever else is going on can be accommodated and can line up even. I'm reminded of the quote of Christ, where he says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all else shall be added unto you." And it kind of felt like that was what was happening. And in coming back to London, I was very clear. It wasn't a change of focus. The focus was exactly the same. Yeah. But it was just a change of context. And that really had allowed me to smooth out what had been a lot of separated pieces before. Yeah.
Well, I also know, in your story that fairly soon after moving to London, you also then became a father, and so you kind of, you had the challenges of, supporting a family. And so how was all of that? I mean, because I know it happened quite quickly after you came back.
Yeah. Well, I guess a part of that sense of anything is possible. Life decided to show me how much was possible. So. My wife actually, I met my wife as she came as a customer to the market that I was working at, and very quickly she became pregnant in a rather unplanned and unorganised way, and so my sense of what my practice was, what this investigation of life was, just kind of had to expand from being predominantly based around meditative experience to a much more all-inclusive sense of exploring life and exploring consciousness, yes, but in the realms of whatever was included, parenting and relationship, and the sense of actually relationship and a family, and the primary relationship with my wife, of that being a monastery, if you like. I mean, I know that sounds a little strange because we associate monasteries with celibacy, but really in terms of, one thinks of a Buddhist monastery, the monastery is the boundary of this context wherein you get to see yourself. You see yourself hitting up against other people, and you live with those people consistently, and you get to see your reactions and your struggles in that way. And relationships always seem to me like the exact same possibility. In one way, conventionally, we see family life as the opposite to a monastic life, but actually they provide some of the very similar contexts. If one commits authentically to a relationship and to one's own work in it, in the same way that one commits authentically to a monastic life and one's own work in it, the same opportunities are there to see, where do my buttons get pressed, where do I get hung up, where do I get caught, and how can I work creatively with that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to this in a little bit, because this, especially with your work, sex, money, Dharma, this integration of real spiritual practice, everyday life, I think is really fascinating. But I just want to kind of finish your story, that I know that you then moved to the French Pyrenees, and you developed the very early days of what's gone on to become quite a large meditation centre. But I know that initially there, again, you lived very, very simply. I remember you telling me a story once that you had no electricity, and I remember you saying someone coming to dinner, and they were coming at 7 o'clock in the evening, you were already in bed because you had no idea what time it was. Yeah. So just tell us a little bit about how that unfolded, and how you perhaps your life moved from your own personal practice to becoming a teacher, and what happened with that.
Well, once my wife was pregnant, I went back to India again, back to stay with Babaji for some more months. And then when I was there, I had the bright idea that instead of going back to London, Gail should come to India to have the baby. So I called her up and said, "Hey, great idea." And
how was your response to that?
Now she looks back and is surprised how readily she jumped at the chance. But so she, having never really been in India, she'd come once for 3 weeks to see me. She came out, and our daughter was born at 2,000 meters in the Himalayas in a little hut, just 10 minutes walk up from where I lived with Babaji. But Gail didn't want to live in India, and especially not with a child. And I'd got used to living in this kind of wild, mountainous environment. So the French Pyrenees seemed like a good contrast. A good compromise. She wanted to be in Europe. I wanted to be in the wilds. So we bought this old bus, and actually we bought it in. It was in London, but from a guy I met in Delhi, and he said he had a bus, and I gave him some money there, and we got this old bus and drove down with no money, no plan, but this vision that we wanted to find somewhere where we could practice, where we could bring up our children, and where we could kind of share a space, partly inspired by the time I'd spent with Babaji, a space where people could come and be in nature and practice meditation and have some sense of spiritual community together. And so in a very organic way that grew, and now it's 15 years we've been doing that. The first 10 years in the Pyrenees, and then when more and more people were coming and the place was just too small, then we've kind of gone up a notch from our no electricity, far off in the woods place we had in those days to the place we have now near Bordeaux, which was a Zen monastery for 15 years, and is a very, very beautiful place where we run retreats through some months of the year.
And I know that, it's probably come up already in what we're saying, and people probably get this perception that, although you're centrally Buddhist in your teaching, there are some different ways that you express that. And I know that, you've called it Freestyle Awakening before, which is some kind of rap kind of style or something. But I'm wondering, a bit about where that comes from, and, what that kind of means to you of having an ancient teaching, but really being able to interpret it in your own way, but also to maintain, the truth and the depth of the teaching as well.
Yeah, well, partly, I think there's lots of different pieces to that. Partly, my own teachers were all quite freestyle themselves. So the months I spent in Thailand with Ajahn Buddhadasa, who's a well-known Thai master who died in the mid-90s, and lived all his life since the age of 20 as a Buddhist monk, and as an austere Buddhist monk within the rules and conventions of that, but was very freestyle in his approach, and he would say nothing's worth attaching to. classic Buddhist line, nothing's worth clinging to. And he'd tug at his robe and say, including this. This is just convention. This isn't the essence of this. And Babaji was very freestyle, and then saying, you do your practice, and not trying to teach me anything. I often say, people say, what did you learn from this hermit? What did he teach you? And I say, well, he never taught me anything, but I learned a lot, out of that freestyle approach. And also my main European teacher, Christopher Titmuss, who was the person who first encouraged me to teach, also had a kind of freestyleness bordering on being a kind of freestyle heretic, like not willing to uphold the sacred cows of something just because of the tradition. Yeah. And I reflect a lot, the word Bud, the root of the word means awake. So Buddhist, means awakeism. So if I think of myself as an awakeist, that I'm really happy with. Yeah. But often the ist or ism stands out more than the bud, and then you get lumbered with conventions. So I think it's important to separate out what's essential. And if what was essential for the Buddha was waking up, then if we're really honest with ourselves, we need to find, well, what really supports me waking up? And if we find something that really supports us, then that's Buddhist, if you like. That's awakeist. And if it doesn't really support it, then we can leave it to the side, even if it has, even if it just because it fits into a certain convention or tradition.
Well, I think a lot of people, what they're looking for is something that they can kind of go, right, that's the teaching. That they on one level they want to be told what to think, what to believe, how to meditate, how to practice. And I guess there's also something very freeing in being encouraged to search for your own truth, and I guess for people to find out, is a teaching really true for them in their experience? And I imagine that especially these days, I think less and less people want to be told what to think. And I'm wondering how you see students respond differently to a more freestyle way of teaching than, perhaps being told what to think and what to believe.
Well, I think different things are different things have value for different people at different times.
Right.
And so for some people, it's actually really helpful to have a very clearly delineated tradition, a clearly explained practice, and that they feel both comforted by that, but also they're actually able to land in and orientate around that in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise, that they would feel confused or lost. Or if you go and hear this teacher and then that teacher and then you go and practice like this and then that, well, how do I put that together? And it becomes very confusing. Yeah. And at the same time, when there's a certain degree of maturity, I think when people really start to discover their own real inner compass, that you're able to discern truth. Like the Buddha talks about, all true teachings have the same taste, the taste of freedom. When you're able to have a certain inner sense of that and how to orientate, then it becomes actually important to not just stay with a tradition, however dear it's been to you, however much great benefit you may have got from it. There's something very valuable to then actually being able to step outside the conventions of that and really see what serves me. And I think, in my own experience at least, one's kind of path, if you like, actually becomes a more of an adventure at that point, because sometimes it's very surprising the triggers of things that are actually really open us up. Like we were just exploring, one of the most significant things for me in the early part of my practice was being evicted, if you like, from India by Babaji and sent back to come down to earth, work in Camden Market, sell Indian clothes. And that really allowed for something very, very important for me that wouldn't have happened if I just stayed sitting in my hut in the Himalayas.
Yeah, well, my sense is also that within you, as you describe it, it sounds like there was also a real willingness, a real kind of availability to what was going to happen. And I guess if someone's not been given a forced teaching or a forced kind of doctrine, that there needs to be even more of them coming into their practice to go, what's true for me? What do I believe? And perhaps it takes more courage for people to to practice in that way, to find out what's true for them.
Yeah, it's certainly less. I mean, it's less comfortable because you don't have the safety net of to follow, if you like.
Yeah. So
I don't know. It's always since those first, what I was speaking about, that contemplations, walking by the speeding cars as a teenager, the sense that all of this exploration of life is an adventure. It's an experiment in consciousness, if you like. And that's really continued, that there's a constant process of discovery, and we don't know where it'll go. And actually, usually, I noticed myself, my predictions of where it might go tend to be predictions that continue on in the same way that it has been going up till now. And my experience is that actually life throws curveballs, is the expression, and that if you make space for that, I don't know. In my own experience, it's been much richer to really make space for the sense that anything can happen, and my practice could look like all kinds of different things, and it may very well not fit into what I think of as traditional models of practice. Right. And that mixes into the work, sex, money, Dharma bit that you were speaking about. Because as in terms of Buddhist tradition anyway, and it's mostly true for most of the Eastern traditions, we've inherited practice forms that are Eastern in their cultural expression, and in the case of Buddhism, mostly monastic in their cultural expression. And then we're practicing in ways that are Western expressions and that are not monastic or renunciate. So we have to find our own authentic expressions of that. And if we're trying to, practice what's essentially a renunciate Asian mode of practice in a Western non-renunciate context, that's not going to work very well.
Yeah, well, I know also, and I guess we see it in the two extremes from your time in the Himalayas to being Camden Market, that move from being isolated to being in relationship. And I know that in your own teaching and also the way that you run the centre, that interrelationship with other people is a significant part of it. And I'm wondering how you see that role of, not just being in silence all of the day. I know often in the mornings people are in silence in your retreats, but the rest of the time being in relationship, and why that's important from your perspective.
Well, at least within the kind of insight meditation Vipassana tradition, which I sort of grew up in, the main practice mode is silent meditation retreats, which have great value. There's something that can be very clarifying and simplifying about being in silence, in such a way that we're very much confronted with our own inner material, because we withdraw from some of what can be the distractions and productions and projections of all that kind of stimulation and engagement with others. But at the same time, one can get very comfortable in the silence, and it can be a way of actually withdrawing and hiding from and avoiding contact, avoiding these other dreaded human beings, So we're simultaneously incredibly drawn to others. One of the most core longings in us is for intimacy. It's something very beautiful to really be with another human being. And yet it's also something quite confronting, because the more we allow ourselves to really fully be with another human being, the more kind of naked, vulnerable we are. So as I began to teach, especially after the first 5 years or so, it became increasingly clear to me that something was getting missed out on, and something had gotten missed out for me as well. It's like, to the extent that I focused on silence and meditation and kind of expanded, rarefied experiences as where all the real juice was, then to that extent I felt somehow lost or lessened or kind of squeezed back into an old egoic way of being when I was in relationship. And so then spiritual life is kind of compartmentalized. Yeah. It's dependent on silence, dependent on meditation, dependent on expanded experience. And then it's like, oh, well, how am I going to manage that with the wife and children and, money to make and the world to live in and the various complexities of just maintaining a normal life? So I got more and more interested, not just myself, but how to facilitate that in terms of teaching for others, in how to bring some of the real beauty and skill that people were developing with being very, very intimate with themselves in meditation, into how to really stay very close to themselves and to life when relating with others, when working, when being in the kind of arenas of our life. So can kind of call those arenas work, sex, and money. The three things that Asian monastic practice basically recognizes are full of charge. We get our identity coalesces a lot around these things, and our clinging and our trouble. We get a lot of energy goes into our working life. A lot of energy goes into our relationships, and a lot of energy goes into how we deal with money. So in the East, they recognize that, and they say, okay, what do? Let's withdraw from working, withdraw from sex, withdraw from money, and then we can really do our practice. And that's a totally valid, wonderful, powerful way of practicing.
Yeah.
But in the Western context, myself and all my students, they're not monastics, so they are working, they are having sex, or they'd like to be. They are. What I really mean is they are in relationships, or they're engaged with that. And they're making a living. Yeah. And so we have to have forms of practice that aren't subtly rejecting those as those areas of life as somehow being unspiritual or unworthy in some ways, but really embracing them, really bringing them into the arena of a spiritual journey.
Well, what I think is also really interesting about the format that you're using with Work, Sex, Money, Dharma is that it's now gone another step. That my understanding is that you're running kind of a weekend, and then people go to work during the day. They do a session in the evening, maybe go home and have sex if they're lucky, I guess. But there's, so it's really bringing Dharma into people's day-to-day life, into their day-to-day experience. And and that I think is quite innovative, quite a new way of doing it. And I'm just wondering how you've seen that impact on people. Because I think that this divide, as you're saying, between what happens on meditation retreat and what happens in day-to-day life, even with the relational component, there's still a separation, and that bringing it into someone's life, I think, is very juicy, and I'm kind of interested how it's impacted people.
Yeah, I mean, people will often talk about I did my practice this morning,
right?
And then by which they mean they meditated for half an hour, and then I wonder, well, what does that mean about the rest of the day? And so there's often this split that even though we might trot out the platitude that all of life is practice, somewhere there's those things that really count as practice, that look like practice because we're sitting in a certain way, or we're doing yoga postures, or whatever it might be, and then we we'll scrabble through the rest of our day, and life goes on in that rhythm until another retreat comes up, or another kind of event in which it all happens. So the interest was to really find a way to have a grounding. Would be supporting people in Dharma practice, in being as close as they could with themselves, having their attention really inside what's happening for them, in tracking them moment to moment, and in providing that kind of support that's there in a retreat in the midst of their lives, as it were. So the course that I've started teaching the last little while, and will continue the next while, in London and San Francisco, and Seattle as well next year. So it's called Work, Sex, Money, Dharma. And the 2 full days of the weekend, where I mostly introduce the material, and we look at it's mostly people that are already have some grounding in a contemplative practice, usually in Buddhist practice, looking at where their practice does or sometimes doesn't meet their working lives, their relationship lives, how they deal with money. That's actually often the most surprising one. Everyone knows they've got issues with their work. Everyone knows they have issues in their relationships, but money, often people don't realise they have so many issues. They just think they'd like a bit more of it, right?
Right.
And actually, it's the place where people are most shocked and surprised to see how much money is to do with so much around confidence and power and status and hopes and all kinds of stuff that they hadn't really realised.
Well, I think often what can happen on the spiritual path is that, we see money as being bad or wrong. The desire to have financial resources somehow being egocentric or kind of showing off somehow. And so what happens is people repress that desire for that, but it's still there. It just comes out in another way. I'm wondering how the Buddhist community and kind of people on other spiritual paths have responded to someone talking about these things in a a very open way. And I would imagine there are some people which are really relieved. I'm wondering if there's also a sense of, oh no, you shouldn't be talking about this in a Buddhist context.
No, I don't think so. That may have been the case, 20 years ago or so. But I think there's a general wave. I don't think I'm in any way unique in feeling like we really need to pay attention to bringing these beautiful traditional Asian practices into a Western context. But I think it's been very refreshing. Certainly, the feedback I've got from students is that it's very refreshing to really meet these things head on. And so after the 2 full days of the weekend, then people come every evening through the week. So they're maintaining their normal working lives, relationship lives, but kind of touching base all the time. And it was actually very, very touching, beautiful for me to see just how much people were able to really shine a lot of light on areas of their life that they kind of dimly knew were going on like that, and yet the kind of light of awareness had never really got there. And so the format seemed really, really helpful for people.
I'm also wondering, in your own life of kind of, which my sense is that's where the teaching's grown from. I know that, for example, you work 1 month a year in the markets in Lyon, I believe it is, and you've kind of found a way to support yourself as a teacher, which often is only by donation and that kind of thing. So what it's meant to you, this material in you very much living in the world, but also keeping space for being open in your own practice.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's through not really feeling like there's any difference between them. I think we get into trouble when we think of our spiritual life. So I've got my spiritual life, and then I've got my family life, and I've got my working life, and I've got my social life. It's like, God, that's too many lives to manage, rather than life. And, what's spiritual life, really, as soon as we start to think of having a spiritual life, it's sort of abstracted from the rest of our life. So whether we're working or whether we're, the various different roles we pass through during the day as worker, as lover, as parent, as washer-upper, or whatever, at different moments of the day, there's what's the thread that runs through all the changing moments of our life, Don't make the spiritual life something that happens, between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning. What's that? If during the time when we're meditating, but just this sense of life as an unbroken, wide open, ever inclusive kind of, life's just beckoning us in all the time, beckoning us in. And then if we really follow that thread that we find in the very fact of being here, being conscious, being awake right now. Right here we find our spiritual life. By very virtue of, the miracle of thinking, feeling, being here. And we find that whether we're in this role or that role, in this activity or that activity, whether we're in the part of life that we call our working life or our love life or anything else. So if we really give real attention, real care, real love to following that thread, then the complexities and the divisions and the thises and the that's kind of fall away.
Well, I guess it's also really interesting when we've got a sense of really being present, being with ourselves, and then we're in an interaction with somebody and we lose that. We lose contact with ourselves, and that tension and that friction of interacting with other people, or with work, whatever else it is. That was almost the mirror to see what's actually happening for us.
Yeah, and people, of course, are a bit more tricky than other things. It's like that's why we find it easy to kind of commune with nature. Right. Trees. Well, this one's plastic, but that's okay.
That's the big conscious TV secret you just lay out.
You meet the natural world, and it's obvious that it's kind of beckoning you in somehow. Yeah. And it seems like there's the space to kind of absorb and pacify your own inner insecurities and projections and stuff. But then when it's another human being, not only does that seem to kind of magnify one's own projections and complexities, but you also see there's a whole bunch of projections and complexities coming from that direction as well. So I think it takes a different kind, or it takes a real courage to actually be willing to really show up for another human being, because it seems threatening. And of course, we've during our whole developmental life since birth, we've had situations that have been threatening, challenging, confusing, difficult. And many of those, or maybe most of the things that have been confusing, challenging, difficult, are other people, right? And so we've somehow learned that the other people are, we're not sure about them. And with good reason sometimes. It's not, sometimes we need to choose who we really open up to,
right. Sometimes the projection's real.
Right. But of course that can lead to a blanket kind of mistrust,
right,
easily. So getting people to work relationally, and sometimes doing what we call meditation out loud, as it were, and actually kind of inquiry into where we're at and what's happening and what's going on with our sense of the other, and that needs a sort of safe environment for people to trust each other. But I found that that's so rich on retreat, because people access a level of kind of protective, egoic holding on that's easy to bypass if you're just spending your practice in a more solitary way.
Well, I guess it's also in that tension. It's an opportunity to really inquire into what's real here. What's my projection that I'm putting onto this person, and what's actually real in this interaction. And we can only really do that in relationship with somebody else. If we're just by ourselves, we can't often see the projections we put onto the world around us. Mm-hmm. I know also that you're using things like video Skype and kind of modern technology, and I'm interested in how that is in terms of, I know you work with a group from where you are in France who are in London who kind of use Skype to access you, and how that is, to really be able to be present with people and be in relationship, but also at that distance.
Well, it's been a very beautiful reminder of the fact that presence and contact is entirely independent of location. Right. A group of students who get together in a house in London maybe, and I'm at my home in France, and then we meet through video Skype, and also working one-to-one with students as well on the phone or via Skype. It's extraordinary actually how the sense of real contact and sensitivity and a kind of alignment to what's going on with the other, and a response, and the person's capacity to feel and hear that response. I would say the sense of presence and contact is every bit as much alive over that kind of distance as it can be face to face. So it's also great because I travel a lot to teach in different countries, and so I think that's one of the beauties. 50 years ago or so, our access to wisdom would have been, whoever the wisest person was in a kind of small radius around where we lived. And now that the communication is so worldwide, it means that I work individually with students in the States or in the UK here or elsewhere in Europe, in Hong Kong, etc.
Well, I think it's been fascinating over the last 25, 30 years, all these different kind of teachings kind of rubbing up against each other, and especially with the kind of the more contemplative practices from the East with more Western psychology and that kind of thing, and also this using of technology. We've got about 5 minutes or so left. I'm wondering, where you see all of this going, how you see your work unfolding, but perhaps also as Buddhism, keeps on developing and changing in response to different needs and different environments, how you see that unfolding in the future?
I have no idea. Like I was saying to you before we started recording, the thread that's followed through my own practice life has been this thread of recognizing something deeply, wonderfully, transformatively possible about spiritual practice, about really interesting oneself in and caring for what's happening, and the way that can, open up in extraordinary, beautiful, transformative ways that completely change one's own sense of how one is in the world, and can completely transform and touch other people as well. And it's always been very clear to me to keep that central and let everything else take care of itself. So in terms of how I see the future unfolding, keep that central. Keep interested. Keep bright. Keep really caring for and checking in with and allowing the unfolding of things. And that gives me a lot of faith that whatever the unfolding of all that was, that it'll have the hallmark of truth, beauty, authenticity to it. So I'd rather stick with that conviction than have a kind of prediction around the future unfolding, either of my work or of Buddhism in general. But, each time Buddhism has moved to a new country or a new culture, it's had to reinvent itself. There's the essence of teachings on awakening. They don't need reinventing, right? But the way that the context, the cultural expressions of that have to be reinvented. And because it's very young in Europe, we tend to look back to the Asian expressions, or how do the Tibetans do it? How do the Zen lot do it? How do the Thais do it, etc.? And of course, when in a few more generations, it's only really 1.5 generations now, in a few more generations there will be more, we'll be able to identify more obvious Western streams of and Western cultural expressions of Buddhist practice. But what's interesting, I think, is we have the opportunity to consciously create those forms. We don't have to just let them happen haphazardly. And so, in some small way, the work, sex, money, Dharma stuff is I hope, a contribution to that. Because one of the quite unique ways that the Western Buddhism seems to be forming is that it's very, very predominantly lay. Most practitioners are not monastic, and that's been the opposite in Asia, where the vast majority have been monastic. So I think that's very exciting. And somehow, because monks and nuns undertake a lot of vows, it's easy to think, oh, that's very proper practice, and this is some kind of flaky version. And for myself, if I really felt like this was a flaky version, I wouldn't be doing it. I'd be in monk's robes, because of that central passion that I was speaking about. So we've got an extraordinary opportunity to kind of to really see how Buddhism can flourish in the West and invent that consciously.
Well, what you're saying kind of reminds me of what Babaji said to you, just get to the bus. And it's kind of, but there's also with being open to each next step, there's a certain lion-heartedness, courageousness, kind of willingness to kind of go, what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
And in the kind of last kind of minute or two, I guess I'm curious as to, because my sense is, as you taught, there's right from being there at 19 years old, there was a kind of a courageousness, a kind of a wanting of something to happen, and a willingness and availability to that. And I think that's often that's the flame which ignites, which kind of supports someone on their journey. And I'm just wondering, anything you have to say about that, or how do people help people find that in themselves as a kind of closing point?
You said it very beautifully. The willingness to not know what's going to happen, the longing to want change, want transformation, want it, long for it, commit to it, but don't have too many ideas of what it ought to look like, because then you narrow all the possibilities. If you think you know what you need to happen, that's not going to work out so well. So if one feels a kind of spiritual longing, amplify it, magnify it, and do whatever it takes. But who knows how it's going to look or where it's going to look. It's going to be different for everyone. It's very interesting that the teachers we most admire, whether that's the Buddha or Christ or the great luminaries, or people we might meet on a smaller scale, if you like, the people we really are moved by, what we're moved by is that they've done something that's fresh and unusual and original and really their own expression. And it's kind of a comedy that then we say, oh, that's so fresh and unusual and beautiful, I want to be just like that or just like them. When the message is, no, don't try and be just like them, but if you want that which is fresh and original and beautiful, this is where fresh and unusual and beautiful is going to come from, you know. So that we have to find our own authentic expression. Everyone we've ever been inspired by, we've been inspired by their own authentic expression. And there's great teachings, there's great support, there's great opportunities there, but those opportunities are not really so that we can fit into someone else's expression. They're there for us to really find the flowering in our own hearts and minds.
Great. That's a great endpoint. Thank you, Martin, for being here.
Yeah.
And you've been watching Conscious TV. We look forward to talking with you again sometime soon.